Caleb Thorne watched the sky choke on its own gray breath. The clouds, heavy and bruised, sagged low over the peaks of the Montana Territory, promising a violence only winter could deliver. He had seen skies like this before, in the fields of Shiloh and the woods of the wilderness, right before the air split with the shriek of lead. This was nature's artillery, a different kind of war, but no less unforgiving. He finished splitting the last log, the axe biting into the frozen pine with a satisfying crack that was swallowed instantly by the rising wind. His world was one of simple, brutal sounds. The ring of steel, the groan of timber, the howl of the wind that was his only constant neighbor. He stacked the wood on the porch of his small, sturdy cabin, each piece a small victory against the coming cold. This place, nestled in a high mountain meadow, was his surrender and his fortress. He had come here after the war to forget the sound of men dying, to replace it with the silence of snow. Solitude was a balm, a clean, cold poultice on a wound that would not heal. It had been 5 years since he had last felt the press of a crowd, 5 years since he had willingly engaged in a conversation that lasted longer than the time it took to trade pelts for flour and salt. People were complications, their emotions like tangled skeins of yarn he had no patience to unravel. His own were knotted tight enough. Inside, the cabin was a testament to his deliberate isolation. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, a bed built into the wall, and shelf holding the few books he had read until their spines cracked. It was a space stripped of everything but necessity. There were no ghosts here, save the ones he carried inside his own head. He stoked the fire, the flames licking hungrily at the new logs, casting flickering shadows that danced like frantic memories. The wind began to moan, a low, mournful sound that was climbing toward a scream. A blizzard, and on Christmas Eve, no less. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. Peace on earth felt like a cruel joke in a world that had shown him none. He settled into his chair with a tin cup of coffee, the heat a welcome ghost against his chilled hands. He was prepared. His larder was full, his woodpile high. He could last a month if he had to. He intended to do just what he always did. Wait for the storm to pass, listen to the silence it left in its wake, and be grateful for the profound, uncomplicated emptiness of his life. He was a man who had walled himself in, and the coming blizzard would only build those walls higher and thicker. It was exactly what he wanted. He closed his eyes, letting the roar of the wind become a featureless drone, a lullaby for a man who had forgotten how to dream. It was a flicker of movement against the blinding white that broke his reverie. He squinted, leaning closer to the single window pane, the glass cold enough to steal the heat from his breath. For a moment, he thought it was a deer driven down from the high ridges by the storm. But it was the wrong shape, a dark slump of color that stumbled and fell. He watched, his gut tightening. A bear, perhaps, wounded and desperate. He reached for the rifle resting against the wall, its stock smooth and familiar in his grip. He had no desire to kill an animal out of season, but he would not be cornered in his own home. He watched for a long moment as the shape struggled to rise again, then collapsed. It was not a bear. It was too small, and there was something else beside it, a larger, darker mound already succumbing to the rapidly accumulating snow. A horse, which meant the first shape was a person. A fool to be caught in a storm like this. His first instinct, honed by years of self-preservation, was to do nothing. This was not his business. The mountains were unforgiving, and they did not distinguish between the wise and the foolish. Getting involved meant trouble. It meant noise and needs, and a disruption to the hard-won quiet of his existence. He turned from the window, his jaw set. He would add another log to the fire and ignore what he had seen. He would pretend it was a trick of the light, a phantom conjured by the swirling snow. But the image was burned into his mind, the small, dark shape, the utter hopelessness of its collapse. He thought of men he had seen fall on the battlefield, their struggles just as futile against an overwhelming force. He had walked past many of them, under orders, his own survival the only mission that mattered. He had lived with that. But this was different. This was not war. This was his mountain, his sanctuary. and there was a body lying in his yard. A curse, low and guttural, escaped his lips. The code he lived by was simple, forged in the crucible of combat, and tempered in the solitude of these peaks. You did not let a man freeze to death if you had a fire. You did not let a person starve if you had food. It was a code devoid of sentiment, a practical matter of honor that had nothing to do with compassion and everything to do with the man he forced himself to be. Leaving someone to die at his doorstep was a line he could not cross. It would haunt him more than the silence ever could. With a sigh of profound reluctance, he pulled on his heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and grabbed a coil of rope from a peg by the door. He was about to invite the world and all its attendant troubles right over his threshold. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and driving icy needles into any exposed piece of skin. The world was a maelstrom of white, the air so thick with snow he could barely see the edge of his own porch. He followed the memory of the shape, leaning into the gale, his boots sinking deep with every step. He found the horse first, a fine-looking mare, her side heaving in shallow, frosted breaths. She was already half buried, her leg bent at an unnatural angle. A broken leg. A death sentence out here. He spared the animal a moment of grim pity before moving on, finding the smaller shape a few yards away. It was a woman. He could tell by the cut of the traveling coat, now caked with ice and snow. She was lying face down, a small valise still clutched in one gloved hand. He knelt, turning her over gently. Her face was pale as alabaster, her lips a faint, terrifying shade of blue. For a moment, he thought he was too late. But then he saw it, a tiny, vaporous puff of breath that was instantly snatched away by the wind. She was alive. Just. He worked quickly, his movements economical and sure. He couldn't carry her and fight the wind. He tied the rope around his waist and then secured it around her torso under her arms. He would have to drag her. It was clumsy, brutal, but it was the only way. He spared one last glance for the dying horse, a silent apology, and then turned his back, pulling his unwelcome burden toward the distant, welcoming light of his cabin. Eleanora Vance drifted in a sea of cold, a place without shape or time. The last thing she remembered was the sickening crack of her horse's leg, the fall into a deep, soft bank of snow that felt almost like a feather bed. She had tried to walk, to push on toward the faint light she thought she'd seen, but her limbs had grown heavy, her thoughts slow and thick as molasses. The cold was a siren, singing a song of sleep, promising a final, dreamless rest. Part of her, the part that was exhausted from running, had wanted to accept the invitation. But another part, the stubborn, resilient core of her being, had clawed for consciousness, for one more step, one more breath. Warmth was the first thing that registered. A deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to be pulling her up from the bottom of a frozen lake. It was a painful, prickling sensation at first, 1,000 tiny needles dancing across her skin. Then came the sound, a steady crackle and pop, underscored by the howl of a terrible wind. She was inside. She was safe. Her eyes fluttered open, heavy as stones. The world came into focus slowly, a low, beamed ceiling, the dark silhouette of a man hunched over a fire, the rough texture of a wool blanket against her cheek. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw, and only a dry croak emerged. The man turned, his movements swift and silent. In the firelight, his face was a study in sharp angles and shadows, dominated by a severe brow and a jaw that looked as if it had been carved from the mountain granite itself. His eyes, a startlingly pale gray, assessed her with an unnerving lack of expression. He was not glad to see her awake. He was not anything. He simply observed her, as one might observe a stray animal that had wandered into a trap. He moved to the hearth, ladling something from a pot into a wooden bowl. He came to her side, kneeling on the floor beside the cot where she lay. He said nothing, simply held the bowl out. It was a thin stew, mostly broth and a few vegetables, but the steam rising from it smelled like salvation. Her hands were too weak to hold it, so he took the spoon and, with an air of grim duty, began to feed her. The silence was absolute, broken only by the storm outside and the small sounds of the spoon against the bowl. Each spoonful was a struggle, but it sent a fresh wave of life through her, chasing the last of the deep cold from her bones. When the bowl was empty, he took it away and returned with a cup of water. He held it to her lips as she drank, his large, calloused hand steady against the back of her head. She studied him over the rim of the cup. He was younger than she first thought, perhaps 30, but his eyes held the weariness of a much older man. There was a scar, thin and white, that cut through his left eyebrow, a permanent accent to his stern expression. He was a man built for this harsh land, broad-shouldered, lean, and radiating a kind of coiled stillness, like a predator at rest. "Thank you," she managed to whisper, her voice raspy. He gave a short, sharp nod, his gaze flicking away from hers, as if her gratitude made him uncomfortable. "Don't talk. Rest." His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges, a voice accustomed to disuse. He retreated to his chair by the fire, turning his back to her, presenting a formidable wall of silence. Nora lay back, her body aching but alive. She was in a stranger's cabin, a man who looked at her as if she were a piece of freight he had been forced to haul. He had saved her life, yet he offered no comfort, no welcome. It was a rescue stripped of all sentiment, a purely mechanical act of preservation. She looked around the small space. It was impeccably clean, organized, and starkly masculine. A single rifle, a stack of books, an axe leaning by the door. It was the home of a man who lived entirely within himself. A loner. An honorable loner, perhaps, but a loner all the same. She, who had been running from the suffocating expectations of society, had stumbled into a world of absolute solitude. And she had, it seemed, dragged its king from his throne. Over the next 2 days, the blizzard raged without pause, imprisoning them in the small cabin. The world beyond the window was a featureless, churning void. For Caleb, it was a familiar state. For Nora, it was a crucible. The initial weakness gave way to a restless energy. She was not a woman accustomed to idleness, and she would not be a helpless burden to her reluctant savior. On the second morning, she swung her legs out of the cot, her head swimming for a moment before the dizziness passed. Caleb was at the table, cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks echoing in the quiet room. He watched her, his hands never ceasing their methodical work. "I can help," she said, her voice stronger now. "With cooking or mending, whatever you need." He didn't look up. "No need. Seat." "I am not an invalid," she insisted, her tone polite but firm. She walked, a little unsteadily, to the small counter where he kept his provisions. Sacks of flour, beans, a slab of bacon. It was basic, but it was enough. "And I will not be treated as one. You saved my life, mister." She paused, realizing she did not even know his name. He finished reassembling the rifle's bolt before he answered, the silence stretching. "Thorne. Caleb Thorne. Mr. Thorne. I am Eleanor Vance, and I would feel much better if I could contribute to my keep." Her directness seemed to surprise him. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes appraising her, as if seeing her for the first time not as a half-frozen victim, but as a person. She met his gaze without flinching. She had spent the last year of her life being managed and controlled by her late father's business partner, Silas Croft, a man who saw her as another asset to be acquired. She was done being passive. A long moment passed. Then, with another of his curt nods, he gestured toward the sacks of flour. "Biscuits," he said, a single word of concession. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. She set to work, her movements becoming more confident as she familiarized herself with his sparse kitchen. She found his supplies were organized with military precision. Everything had its place. She worked quietly, efficiently, mixing the dough, her hands remembering the familiar rhythms of the kitchen back home, a place she could no longer return to. She was surprised to find that the simple, domestic task grounded her. It was a piece of her old life, a skill that was still hers, even now when she had nothing else. Caleb watched her from the corner of his eye. He had expected helplessness, perhaps tears or demands. He had not expected quiet competence. She moved with an economy of motion that he appreciated. She did not chatter or fuss. She simply worked. When the biscuits were baking in the cast-iron skillet on the hearth, filling the cabin with a warm, comforting aroma, she found his mending kit and began repairing a small tear in one of his shirts. He found the sight strangely unsettling. The cabin had been his space, an extension of himself. Her presence, her work, her scent, the faint, clean smell of soap and the yeast from the biscuits was changing it. It was an invasion, albeit a quiet one. They ate the meal in their now customary silence. The biscuits were light and perfect. He ate 3 of them without comment. But he noticed she had also made a gravy from the bacon drippings, a small, thoughtful addition that transformed the simple meal. It was the best food he had eaten in years. The recognition of this fact was a crack in his armor. He had convinced himself he needed nothing, that sustenance was enough. But this was more than sustenance. This was a meal. It felt domestic. The word itself was foreign, dangerous. "You are a long way from wherever you started," he said, breaking the silence. It was not a question, but an observation. Nora finished her mouthful before answering, choosing her words with care. "I was heading to Oregon, to start a new life. Bad time of year to be crossing the mountains alone. I had a guide," she explained, her gaze dropping to her plate. "He was supposed to meet me in the town of Three Forks. He never arrived. I waited 2 days. My money was running low, and I panicked. I thought I could make it to the next way station before the storm." She did not mention Silas, or the reason she was running. It was too much to share with this stern, silent man. Caleb just nodded. He understood desperation. He had seen what it did to men. "Foolish," was all he said, but there was no heat in the word. It was a simple statement of fact. "Yes," she agreed quietly. It was... The admission seemed to satisfy him. He gathered their plates, moving to the wash basin. Nora stood to help, but he waved her off with a sharp gesture. "My cabin. My chore." She sat back down, watching his broad back as he worked. He had saved her, and now he was feeding her and washing her plate. Yet he kept her at a distance with his silence and his terse commands. It was a confusing contradiction. He was a man of honor, but not of warmth. She wondered what had happened to him to make him build such high walls around himself. What war was he still fighting in the silence of these mountains? She felt a strange kinship with him then. They were both refugees, in their own way, seeking sanctuary from a world that had wounded them. The storm continued its assault for 3 more days. A strange and quiet rhythm established itself within the 4 walls of the cabin. In the mornings, Caleb would venture out to check on his snares and see to the small lean-to where he kept a milk cow. Returning covered in snow, a blast of frigid air his herald. Nora would have coffee ready and a small breakfast cooking on the hearth. During the day, they worked in a shared, comfortable silence. He would mend his gear or carve, his hands surprisingly deft as he shaped a piece of wood. She would read from one of his few books, Shakespeare, the Bible, a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius, or mend his clothes with neat, almost invisible stitches. He was surprised by her resilience. She never complained about the cold, the simple food, or the lack of amenities. She accepted the reality of their situation with a quiet dignity that he found himself respecting. He learned things about her not from her words, but from her actions. He learned she was resourceful when she used leftover bacon grease and ash to make a crude but effective soap. He learned she was patient when she spent an entire afternoon painstakingly restitching a seam on his winter coat. He learned she was not easily intimidated when she met his gruff silences with a calm serenity of her own. The evenings were the hardest. After the final meal, the darkness and the storm would press in, making the small cabin feel even smaller. The fire was the only source of light and life, its flames a hypnotic dance that invited introspection. It was on the 5th night, Christmas night having passed in a quiet exchange of shared stew, that the silence finally broke. Nora was staring into the flames, her face etched with a deep sadness. Caleb watched her, an unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It was an impulse he had long since suppressed, the urge to offer comfort. He fought it, telling himself it was not his place. But the silence felt different tonight, not peaceful, but heavy with unspoken sorrow. "My father passed a year ago," she said suddenly, her voice soft, barely rising above the crackle of the fire. "He loved this time of year. He would fill the house with the smell of pine and roasted chestnuts. He was a good man, a trusting man." Her voice caught on the last words. Caleb remained silent, but he did not turn away. He listened, giving her the space her words needed. "Too trusting," she continued, a bitter edge to her voice. "He left his business and my care to his partner, Mr. Croft." She spoke the name as if it were a poison she was spitting out. "Silas Croft saw me as just another part of the inheritance, another asset to be managed and eventually owned. He was kind at first, a perfect gentleman, but his kindness was a cage. He made it clear that I was to be his wife. That was my father's dying wish. It was a lie. My father would never have. He wanted me to be happy." She finally looked at him, her eyes shimmering in the firelight. "I was trapped. He controlled my finances, my home, everything. To everyone in Boston, he was my generous guardian. To me, he was a jailer. So I took what jewelry I could hide, sold it for cash, and I ran. I thought if I could just make it to Oregon, I could disappear. I could be a teacher or a seamstress. I could be my own person." Caleb absorbed her story, the pieces clicking into place. Her flight, her desperation, her competence. She was not merely a fool who had gotten lost. She was a refugee from a gilded prison. He saw the steel beneath her genteel surface, and his respect deepened into something more complex, something he refused to name. Her vulnerability called to a part of him he thought had died in the war, a protective instinct that had nothing to do with his code and everything to do with the woman sitting across from him. He felt a sudden, sharp need to offer something of himself in return, to balance the scales of their shared confidence. The words came haltingly, dragged from a place of deep burial. "I was a captain," he said, his voice a low rumble. "In the infantry. I lost my entire company at Cold Harbor. 74 men." He stared into the fire, but he was not seeing the flames. He was seeing the field, the smoke, the impossible charge into a wall of entrenched rifles. "I led them there. I followed the orders. They followed me. They died, and I lived. There's no sense in it. Just chance." He fell silent, the confession hanging in the air between them. He had never spoken of this to anyone, not a soul. To give it voice was to make it real in a way it had not been before. He felt exposed, stripped bare. He braced himself for pity, for the platitudes people offered when faced with a grief they could not comprehend. But Nora offered neither. She simply watched him, her expression filled with a profound and sorrowful understanding. "Sometimes surviving is the harder part," she said softly. Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. She understood. In that moment, she saw the guilt that was the true source of his solitude. She saw that his fortress was also his prison, a bond unspoken but deeply felt, formed between them in the flickering firelight. They were two survivors, each bearing their own scars, who had found a momentary ceasefire in a storm. The air in the cabin shifted after that night. The silence was no longer a barrier, but a shared space. The tension that had been one of awkwardness now hummed with a different energy, a heightened awareness of each other. When their hands brushed as he passed her a log for the fire, a jolt passed between them, sharp and undeniable. Caleb found his eyes drawn to her more often, the way a loose strand of her dark hair curled at her temple, the determined set of her jaw as she concentrated on a task, the unexpected warmth in her smile when she caught him looking. This growing attraction was a terrifying complication. Caleb had organized his life to avoid such feelings. Emotions were weaknesses, openings through which pain could enter. Love and connection were for other men, men who had not seen what he had seen, men who were not hollowed out. He found himself growing angry, at her for being there, at himself for feeling anything at all. He became more withdrawn, his answers shorter, his movements more abrupt. He was trying to rebuild his walls, but she had already slipped inside them. He felt a desperate need to push her away for her own good. A woman like her, resilient and good, deserved a whole man, not the broken remnant he was. The storm broke on the seventh day. The wind died down, and a brilliant, blinding sun rose over a world transformed. The snow lay in deep, sculpted drifts, glittering as if sewn with diamonds. It was beautiful, and it was a threat. The end of their isolation was at hand. Caleb knew he had to go to town for supplies. The thought of leaving her alone, even for a few hours, filled him with a disquiet he did not want to examine. The thought of returning her to the world filled him with something even worse. "I'm heading to town," he announced that morning, his tone gruff. "I need flour, salt. You'll be safe here. No one will find you." Nora nodded, her expression unreadable. "Be careful, Caleb." It was the first time she had used his given name. It sounded strange, intimate. He gave a curt nod, grabbed his snowshoes and rifle, and left without another word, the sound of her voice following him out into the cold, bright morning. The journey to town was arduous, the snow waist-deep in places. The physical exertion was a welcome distraction from the turmoil in his mind. The town of Jasper's Gulch was little more than a single dusty street, now a street of packed snow, with a general store, a saloon, and a sheriff's office. As Caleb traded his pelts for supplies at the store, he felt the familiar press of civilization, the idle chatter and curious stares of the townsfolk. He hated it. As he was loading his goods onto the small sled he had dragged, two men stepped out of the saloon. They were not locals. They wore expensive city coats that were ill-suited for the mountain winter, and they carried themselves with an arrogance that set Caleb's teeth on edge. "You there," the taller one called out, his voice slick with authority. "You live up in the high country." Caleb finished tying his sack of flour before he turned to face them. He said nothing, simply met their gaze with his flat, gray stare. "We're looking for someone," the second man said, stepping forward. He was heavy-set, with a brutish face. A woman. Dark hair, fancy Eastern clothes. Might have been on a fine bay mare. "You seen anyone like that?" Caleb's blood ran cold. "Croftsman." He kept his face a mask of indifference. "Haven't seen anyone. Been snowed in for a week." The tall man narrowed his eyes, studying Caleb's worn buckskins, his weathered face, the rifle he held loosely in his hand. "A man like you, living alone, you'd notice a pretty thing like her. There's a handsome reward for her return to her guardian, Mr. Silas Croft." "Her guardian?" Caleb repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Funny. From what I hear, the lady is of age. Sounds more like your bounty hunters tracking a runaway." The brutish man's hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip. "You be wise to watch your mouth, mountain man. Mr. Croft is a powerful man. He gets what he wants," he smirked. "And right now he wants his fiancée back. She's a spirited thing, but she'll learn her place." Something inside Caleb snapped. The crude, possessive way the man spoke of Nora ignited a protective fury that was hot and absolute. He didn't think. He moved. In two swift strides, he closed the distance between them. Before the man could even clear his gun from its holster, Caleb's hand shot out, grabbing him by the front of his coat and slamming him back against the saloon wall. The wood groaned under the impact. "She is not a thing," Caleb snarled, his face inches from the man's, his voice a low, lethal rasp. "And if you or anyone else comes sniffing around my land, the only thing you'll find is a shallow grave before the spring thaw." He held the man there for a long, terrifying moment, letting him feel the cold, hard promise of violence. The man's arrogant smirk had vanished, replaced by a sheen of sweat and fear. The taller man had his hand on his own weapon, but he seemed unwilling to test the stranger who had moved with such deadly speed. Finally, Caleb shoved the man away. He stumbled and fell into a snowdrift. "Stay out of my mountains," Caleb said, his voice returning to its normal, quiet register. He turned his back on them, a calculated risk, and began pulling his sled down the street. He did not look back. He could feel their eyes on him, but he knew they would not challenge him again. Not today. He stopped at the sheriff's office before he left. Sheriff Brody was an older man, with a kind face and eyes that missed nothing. He had known Caleb for years, respecting his privacy, but keeping a watchful eye. "Trouble, Caleb?" Brody asked, seeing the look on his face. "Couple of men in town. Hire guns look like." Asking after a woman, Caleb kept his description brief, clinical. They worked for a man named Silas Croft. Brody nodded slowly, stroking his chin. "Saw them. Smelled of money and trouble. I'll keep an eye on them. You find anything on your land, you let me know." "I will," Caleb said. It was as close to asking for help as he was capable of getting. The journey back to the cabin was fueled by a cold, simmering rage. They knew she had come this way. They were actively searching. His land was remote, but not undiscoverable. They would find her eventually. When he finally reached the clearing, the sight of the smoke curling from his chimney sent a wave of profound relief through him, followed immediately by a surge of dread. That smoke was a beacon. His sanctuary had become her cage, and it was no longer safe. Nora was waiting for him, her face anxious. She saw the grim set of his jaw and knew immediately that something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked as he stepped inside. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "Croft's men are in town. 2 of them. They're looking for you." The color drained from her face. "They found me." It was a whisper of despair. "I have to leave. I can't bring this trouble to you." She started toward her valise. "And go where?" he demanded, his voice sharp, stopping her in her tracks. "They're watching the roads. You'll be in the valley less than a day before they find you. Use your head." "Then what am I to do?" she cried, her composure finally cracking. "I can't go back to him, Caleb. I won't." He watched her, his mind racing, turning over every possibility, every angle. There was only one path he could see. It was drastic, insane, and felt terrifyingly, undeniably right. It was a solution that was both practical and, if he was honest with himself, something he wanted for reasons that had nothing to do with practicality. "They're looking for Eleanora Vance, a runaway ward," he said, thinking aloud. "They're not looking for a married woman. They are not looking for Mistress Thorne." Nora stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you saying?" He finally met her gaze, his own gray eyes intense and unwavering. "I'm saying Silas Croft would have no legal claim on another man's wife. It would be a marriage of convenience. A shield. I will give you my name. To protect you." The proposal hung in the air between them, a shocking, impossible thing. A marriage of convenience. Nora's mind reeled. She had run from one unwanted marriage only to be offered another. But this was different. This was not a cage. This was, as he said, a shield. It was a way out, a path to the freedom she so desperately craved. And it was being offered by the man who had saved her life, the man with whom she had shared a profound and unexpected connection. She looked at Caleb, truly looked at him. She saw past the stoic exterior to the honorable man beneath. He was offering her his name, his home, his protection. It was a sacrifice, a complication to the solitary life he cherished. He was willing to do that for her. Her heart, which she had thought was numb with fear, began to beat with a different, more powerful emotion. "A marriage of convenience," she repeated softly, testing the words. She thought of her options. She could run and likely be caught, or she could accept this incredible, unconventional offer. She thought of a life tied to this man in this cabin on this mountain. The idea should have terrified her. It did not. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But on one condition." Caleb's eyebrows drew together. "What condition?" "If we are to do this, if we are to be married, it will not be a lie," she said, her courage surprising even herself. "It will be a real partnership. We will share the work, the burdens, the respect. I will not be a ward in your home, Caleb. I will be your wife." He stared at her, stunned into silence. She was not just accepting his practical solution. She was raising the stakes, demanding an emotional truth he had not been prepared to offer. She was asking for the one thing he feared most, a genuine connection. To agree would be to let her past his final wall, to admit that what he felt for her was more than protective duty. It was to admit that the thought of her leaving was more terrifying than the thought of her staying. He saw the strength in her gaze, the unwavering resolve. She was offering him a chance not just to save her, but to save himself from the empty fortress he had built. It was the most courageous thing he had ever seen. A real partnership, he echoed, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. All right, Nora. A real partnership. The next morning, they rode his sturdy packhorse down the mountain, the single animal navigating the snowy trail with care. They rode in silence, the weight of their decision settling around them. It was a cold, clear day. The world felt new, fragile. When they reached Jasper's Gulch, Caleb led the horse straight to the sheriff's office. Croft's men were nowhere in sight. Sheriff Brody looked up as they entered, his gaze moving from Caleb's determined face to Nora's composed one. He raised an eyebrow. "Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We need a preacher. We're getting married." Brody's jaw dropped for a second before he recovered, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be. Circuit preacher's in town. Staying with us. Martha," he called to his wife in the back room. "Reverend Miller's got a wedding to perform." The ceremony was a blur. It took place in the sheriff's small, tidy parlor, with Brody and his warm, smiling wife, Martha, as their witnesses. The Reverend Miller was a kind man with gentle eyes who seemed to sense the urgency and strangeness of the situation and asked no questions. Nora stood beside Caleb, her hand trembling slightly in his. His hand was large and warm, and his grip was steady, a silent anchor in the whirlwind of the moment. She listened to the Reverend's words about devotion and partnership, words that should have felt hollow in a marriage born of necessity. But they did not. Looking at Caleb's stoic profile, she felt a profound sense of rightness. This was her choice. This was her path. "You may kiss the bride," the Reverend said, his voice soft. The room fell silent. Caleb turned to her. His gray eyes were dark with an unreadable emotion. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, and in that hesitation, Nora saw his fear, his vulnerability. It mirrored her own. Then, he leaned down and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of solemn promise. It was chaste, brief, and yet it felt more real than anything she had ever known. It was the seal on their pact, the beginning of a life she had never imagined. When he pulled away, the world had shifted on its axis. She was no longer Eleanor Vance, the runaway. She was Nora Thorne, a married woman, and the honorable loner beside her was now her husband. Their return to the cabin was as silent as their journey down, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the quiet of two strangers, but the charged, uncertain silence of a husband and wife who knew nothing about being married. The cabin, which had been Caleb's solitary domain, was now their shared home. The single chair at the table suddenly seemed impossibly lonely. The narrow cot where she had slept felt entirely inadequate. That night, Caleb laid a second bedroll for himself on the floor by the fire. It was a gesture of respect, but it also felt like a line drawn between them. Nora lay in the cot, her mind racing. She was married, legally, irrevocably bound to the man, sleeping a few feet away. She listened to the sound of his breathing, a steady, rhythmic presence in the dark. Fear and a strange, hopeful excitement warred within her. The attack came 3 days later, at dusk. They had been lulled into a false sense of security by the quiet. Caleb had spent the day building a second chair, his hands shaping the wood with a focused intensity. Nora had been organizing the shelves, making the space feel more like a home. For a few hours, they had almost felt like a normal married couple. The first warning was the crunch of snow outside, too heavy to be a deer. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, his rifle in his hand, his body a tense line of readiness. He motioned for her to get down, away from the window. "Stay down and stay quiet," he whispered, his voice deadly calm. A voice boomed from outside, dripping with arrogance and rage. "Thorne, I know she's in there. Send out my property, and I might let you live. Silas Croft." Nora's blood ran cold. He had found them. Caleb moved to the window, peering cautiously through a small gap in the frame. He saw Croft, flanked by the 2 men from town and 2 others. 5 of them, all armed. "She's not your property, Croft," Caleb shouted back, his voice ringing with authority. "She's my wife." A harsh, disbelieving laugh answered him. "A pathetic little lie. It won't save you. I'm coming in." The first shot splintered the wood of the door. The siege had begun. Caleb fired back, not to kill, but to keep them pinned down. He was a soldier, a strategist. He knew he was outmanned and outgunned. This was not a fight he could win through force alone. Nora huddled behind the overturned table, her heart pounding against her ribs. She would not be a passive victim. She would not let Caleb die for her. She remembered the spare rifle, the one he kept on a rack above the fireplace. She crawled toward it, her movements desperate but purposeful. "What are you doing?" Caleb hissed, firing another shot through the window. "Helping," she said, her voice tight with resolve. She reached the hearth, pulling the heavy rifle down. "I know how to load one. My father taught me." Caleb stared at her for a half-second, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, before he turned his attention back to the fight. "Load it. Don't fire unless I tell you." The exchange of gunfire continued, the small cabin filling with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The windows shattered, letting in the biting cold. They were trapped. Croft's men were fanning out, trying to find a weak point. Caleb moved from window to window, his shots carefully placed, making them think he was more than one man. Then, one of Croft's men managed to get around to the back, smashing the small rear window. Caleb spun to fire, but another shot from the front forced him to take cover. The man was climbing through the window, a pistol in his hand, his eyes fixed on Caleb's exposed back. There was no time to warn him. Nora raised the heavy rifle she had just finished loading. She didn't aim. She just pointed it at the dark shape in the window and pulled the trigger. The kick of the rifle slammed into her shoulder, a brutal, shocking force. The roar of the shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The man in the window grunted, a look of utter surprise on his face, before he pitched backward into the snow and lay still. Caleb stared at her, his eyes wide. She had saved his life. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. In that moment, she was not a woman he was protecting. She was his partner, his equal, fighting beside him. She was his wife. The brief lull was broken by an enraged roar from Croft. "Useless fools! Burn him out!" A flaming torch arched through the broken front window, landing on the dry wood of the floor. Flames erupted, licking hungrily at the walls. They were being burned alive. Caleb grabbed a bucket of water from a basin and doused the worst of it, but the cabin was filling with thick, choking smoke. They were out of time. Just as despair began to set in, another sound cut through the chaos. A volley of rifle fire from outside, but not from Croft's men. It came from the trees at the edge of the clearing. "Drop your weapons. This is Sheriff Brody. You're surrounded." The unexpected arrival of the law threw Croft's men into a panic. The tide had turned. A fierce, brief gunfight erupted in the clearing. When the shooting stopped, 2 more of Croft's men were down. The others had surrendered. But Croft, consumed by a mad rage, made a final, desperate charge for the cabin door, his pistol raised. Caleb met him on the threshold. The 2 men grappled, a brutal, close-quarter struggle. Croft was strong, but Caleb was a soldier. He disarmed him with a swift, practiced move, sending the pistol flying. He slammed his fist into Croft's jaw, and the man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The threat was over. Sheriff Brody and his 2 deputies entered the smoking, wrecked cabin. Brody looked from the bound prisoners outside to the dead man in the snow, to the unconscious Croft, and finally to Caleb and Nora, who stood together amidst the debris. "Looks like you 2 can handle yourselves," the sheriff said, his voice a mixture of relief and admiration. "I got suspicious when Croft and his men rode out of town armed for a war. Figured I'd follow. Good thing I did." In the aftermath, as the sheriff and his men were securing the prisoners, a profound quiet descended on the clearing. The battle was over. Nora and Caleb stood in the doorway of their ravaged home, the cold night air washing over them. The logs of the wall were scorched, the windows were gone, and the floor was a mess of shattered glass and splintered wood. Nora began to tremble, the delayed shock of the fight coursing through her. Caleb turned to her, his face grim in the moonlight. He reached out, his hands gently taking her by the shoulders. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice raw. She shook her head, unable to speak. She looked at him, her husband, the man who had been willing to die for her. And she looked at their home, nearly destroyed. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of fear, of relief, of a sorrow so deep she could not name it. "This was all for nothing," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The marriage, the fight, it was just a convenience. A lie." Caleb's grip on her shoulders tightened, his gaze fierce. "No," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "It was never a lie for me, Nora. Not from the moment I proposed. I was a fool. I called it convenience, because I was afraid to call it what it was." He pulled her closer, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "I came to these mountains to be alone, to hide from the world, to hide from myself. I thought I wanted silence. But then you came. You filled the silence. And I realized my life wasn't quiet. It was just empty." He looked into her eyes, his own gray eyes shining with a truth that shattered all his walls. "I love you, Nora. I think I have since you lectured me about making biscuits. Seeing you in danger, it wasn't my honor I was defending. It was my life. You were my life." The declaration, so raw and heartfelt, stole her breath. All the fear and uncertainty washed away, replaced by a love so powerful it felt like the sun rising after a long, dark night. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. "I love you too. I was so afraid to hope, but I love you." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if her words were a balm on his old wounds. Then he leaned in and kissed her. It was nothing like their first kiss in the sheriff's parlor. This was a kiss of desperation and triumph, of promises kept and a future claimed. It was fierce and deep, a confirmation of everything they had survived and everything they were about to build. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the ruins of their home, the cold air swirling around them. But they did not feel the cold. They had a different kind of fire now, one that would burn brighter and longer than any torch Croft could ever throw. "We can rebuild," he said against her hair. "We'll build it bigger, stronger, a real home. Our home," she agreed, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Her flight was over. His isolation had ended. They had found their sanctuary not in a place, but in each other. On this broken, beautiful piece of land, they would build their future, log by log, promise by promise. 5 years later, the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across a thriving homestead. The original cabin still stood, but it was now the heart of a much larger, handsomer ranch house. A sturdy barn stood nearby, and the contented lowing of cattle drifted up from the expanded pasture. Fences, straight and strong, traced the edges of the meadow where once there had been only wilderness. Nora Thorne stood on the wide front porch, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the aspen trees that now shaded the yard. She rested a hand on the gentle swell of her belly, where their second child grew. Her gaze was fixed on a small boy of 4, his hair the same dark shade as her own, who was chasing butterflies with a focused determination that was entirely his father's. The front door opened, and Caleb came out, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He had changed in the past 5 years. The harsh, haunted lines around his eyes had softened, replaced by the crinkles of a man who knew how to smile. The stoic silence was still a part of him, but it was a comfortable, peaceful silence now, not a defensive one. He handed her a mug, his fingers brushing hers in a familiar, tender gesture. He stood beside her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, pulling her close. They stood together, watching their son, Daniel, finally catch a butterfly in his cupped hands, his face alight with pure joy. "He has your patience," Caleb said, his voice a low, contented rumble beside her ear. "And your stubbornness," Nora countered with a soft laugh. "He will not be a rancher. He will be a general." Caleb chuckled, the sound warm and easy. "Let's hope he doesn't have to be." They fell into a comfortable silence, sipping their coffee, the rhythms of their life together as natural as breathing. The horrors of their first week together seemed like a story from another lifetime. Silas Croft was a distant memory, serving a long sentence in a federal prison. Their life was here, built with their own hands, solid and real. Nora had even achieved her dream of being a teacher. Once a month, she held classes in their large front room for the children of the few other families who had settled in the surrounding valleys. "Do you ever miss it?" Caleb asked quietly, his gaze sweeping over the majestic peaks that surrounded them. "Boston? The life you had." Nora leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of pine, leather, and him. "I don't miss the life I had," she said. "Sometimes I miss the woman I was." She was so certain she had to be independent to be strong. She didn't understand. Understand what? "That real strength isn't about standing alone," she said, looking up at him, her love for him clear in her eyes. "It's about finding the one person worth standing with." He tightened his arm around her, his heart full. He had thought this mountain was his refuge from the world, a place to hide his broken pieces. But it had only been a waiting place. Nora was his refuge. She had taken his broken pieces and shown him how to build a life with them. Daniel ran up to the porch, his small face flushed with excitement. "Look," he whispered, carefully opening his hands. The butterfly, a brilliant spot of blue against his skin, rested there for a moment before taking flight, fluttering up into the vast, clear sky. Caleb crouched down, ruffling his son's hair. "You have to let things go, son, so they can be free." As he stood up, he looked at Nora, his gray eyes holding a universe of love and gratitude. He remembered finding her in the snow, a fragile, half-frozen stranger he had reluctantly saved. It was Christmas Eve, a day he had long associated with loss and bitter memories. Now, it was the foundation of his entire world. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss filled with the quiet certainty of their shared years and the promise of all the years to come. "That blizzard," he murmured against her lips, his voice soft. "The world was ending, and my life was just beginning. It felt like fate." Nora smiled, her heart overflowing. "It wasn't fate, my love," she whispered back, taking his hand and lacing her fingers through his. "It was Christmas.